Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with Chapter 12 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Let's find out what happens next. Despite the huge amount of road travel we were doing, we still had a lot of time on our hands. Doing our best to accentuate the positive, we worked on new material in the car or our hotel rooms, and went on a serious sci-fi and fantasy reading binge. I had never been much of a reader, but with the hundreds of miles we had to cover, and Neil's knowledge and veracity for inspiration, I too began to devour books, trying to catch up on all I had missed by quitting school. Neil was always reading. He turned Alex and me onto the Russian-born Jewish-American author Ayn Rand, and it was in the Fountainhead that I found some moral reinforcement against the dire situation the band was then facing. In the novel, her protagonist, Howard Roark, stands up defiantly for the rights of the individual and passionately against the concept of artistic compromise. How about that for timing? Just as our management and record company were turning up the heat and pressuring us to come up with something more commercial. Rand's book Anthem was the clincher. It's a dystopian novella set in a bleak and totalitarian world in which a lone outcast, Equality 7-2521, dares to think for himself, and to the wrath of the tyrannical World Council of Scholars, accidentally rediscovers electricity. Neil suggested we use this book as a jumping-off point for a story of our own, and soon it was clear we were developing another concept album. In February, we had 4 weeks booked at Toronto Sound to record what in many ways felt like our last chance to make a statement about who we were and what we wanted to become. We decided, let's do this now or go down trying. I'd like to call it courage, but I'm not sure that in 1976 we were fully aware of the risks we were taking. There are times in life when economic circumstances have an emancipating effect on the decisions you make. One is when you've saved up enough money that you can follow your bliss. The other is when you're at the end of your rope and no longer care about the consequences of your actions. At that moment, we decidedly fell into the second category. In the middle of the Canadian winter, we hunkered down, and straight away, things started to click. We were working much more efficiently than we had on Caress of Steel, partly due to the heightened confidence in our playing after so many gigs, almost 200 in 1975 alone, partly from a measure of defiance, and perhaps partly this time from the absence of hash oil. We finished some writing left over from the road, laid down the bed tracks, and once all the individual sequences of the 2112 album side had taken shape, came around to the idea of assembling some of the prominent musical themes or riffs for a tongue-in-cheek take on that more famous overture that ends in 12. I can't recall if it was always our intention to pull that off, but it's likely. I do remember the three of us sitting in the back of the control room with our instruments saying, okay, we'll use this riff from this piece and this movement from that one. And lo, they flowed together pretty well. Neil may have had the 1812 overture in the back of his mind when he came up with the title, and I know he wanted to use a palindrome. 2112 was visually striking, and we just couldn't resist taking the piss. Maybe still smarting from accusations of pretentiousness, I feel like I have to point out that it was a joke, as was the diddle iddle iddle id da da that Alex put on at the end. Roll over, Tchaikovsky. I wouldn't go so far as to call 2112 a symphonic piece, but it certainly had elements in common with symphonic music, such as themes and motifs, and its length and multiple time changes made its structure sound more complex and dynamic than Caress of Steel. More than an orchestral symphony, it was a raw, three-piece rock opera. We didn't even use a lot of keyboards back then. Just the swishy, swirly journey through the stars to the Solar Federation off the top, and our first taste of orchestration on side 2. I wasn't even using bass pedals much yet. It was on the next album, A Farewell to Kings, that I'd tackle many Moog and Taurus devices. Alex's ricocheting guitar near the start was inspired by the way side 1 of Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick ends, and side 2 begins. Having resolved that it was a rock opera, we set the scene for its totalitarian world with a deliberate pomposity and approached the lyrics the way you would a libretto, with me singing different characters. The innocent protagonist versus the priest in the temples of Syrinx. I was learning how to use my voice as an interpreter, like an actor does. I had to make myself believe in what I was singing to the point of getting lost in the roles, for the audience would only believe it if I believed it. We wanted the finale to be ambiguous. I took the optimistic view that the priests were vanquished and the temples destroyed. But I remember Neil talking about the two factions still fighting when a third party swoops in to take overall control. He and I talked about the Ayn Rand concept of sense of life, how each of us views the world and makes decisions based on individual values. And in that spirit, it felt best not to spell everything out. Was it a rebellion of the oppressed masses or an invasion of liberating forces? That's up to you to decide. And I believe one of the essential things that listeners were engaged by and responded to so well. To contrast the singular theme of 2112, we wanted side 2 to have as much musical variety as we could muster. A passage to Bangkok, for example, was a travelage in the mind of an aficionado of fine herbal substances, but written by 3 guys who had never been east of England or west of Vancouver. Then a rarity, one song that featured lyrics by Lurks called Lessons, and another by me called Tears. That was pretty much the last time we credited individual works. It's hard to always know who contributes what to the writing of a song, especially when it comes down to the cold business of who gets a publishing credit and who doesn't, meaning who gets paid. For example, in some bands, a part like a guitar solo is usually considered nothing more than part of the general arrangement and doesn't rate on the pay scale. That's often the reality, but can you imagine Stairway to Heaven without the guitar solo? Even if that was all that Jimmy Page had contributed, it would certainly have been deserving of a songwriting credit, no? This is why I always hated divvying up the credits. For me, every musical part was integral. In later years, whenever we'd record at Le Studio in Quebec, we'd hear all kinds of gossip from the staff about arguments other bands had had. The Police, for instance, fought tooth and nail over who would get the B-side. Because, of course, if you sold 1 million singles, even the guy who wrote the B-side reaped a royalty reward. Well, we had 0 hit singles to worry about, so it was easy for us to take the high road. But regardless, hearing that reinforced the decision we were about to take. From A Farewell to Kings onward, every song would be divided equally among the 3 of us. All for one and one for all. A working democracy. For the rest of our career, we would never have to talk about that again. And to a great degree, It was one of the secrets of our longevity. Another Rush tradition in the making of 2112 was the spontaneous studio track. The album was just about complete, but needed one final musical moment. With less than a day of studio time remaining, we wrote and recorded The Twilight Zone on the spot, an homage to its creator Rod Serling, whom we considered a genius and an inspiration. Written and recorded in the afternoon and mixed that night, what a breath of fresh air it was for both the album side and our recording mythology. After meticulously and painstakingly grinding through every single moment of the record that far, it was a joy to be so spontaneous. So much so that we'd summon that spontaneity again with vital signs on moving pictures, New World Man on Signals, and Malignant Narcissism on Snakes and Arrows. All were last-minute inspirations. 2112 took 4 weeks to record, and all in all, it's the album we wanted to make, defiantly oblivious to other people's expectations. We felt triumphant. If we were going down, at least we were going down swinging. Naturally, we wanted people to like it, but we had to love it first. We were the 3 Musketeers now. No management in the room, no record company, just Terry and us. You might have imagined that at the end of a good day in the studio, I'd give a sneak preview to Nancy or a close friend or two, but no. She wasn't very keen, to be honest, and kept a respectful distance from our work in progress. She felt that her opinions about my music were superfluous. Early in a tour, she'd want to check out the new visuals, but she was usually more interested in what they were serving for our crew meal, and would sometimes fly out to see me without attending the concert at all. I really wasn't interested in anyone else's opinions, however sensitive or considered, least of all while we were creating. I wanted us to make our own decisions, without being influenced either consciously or unconsciously, even if that meant making our own mistakes. So, we were in the dark, and when 2112 appeared to be a kind of hit, you could have knocked us over with a feather. I don't mean it was a hit on the radio. It was too long and weird for mainstream. But with the word of mouth and the all-important radio request lines, plus the reaction we'd enjoy in concert, we felt we were really hitting a nerve. It made number 5 on the Canadian album charts, and was our first to crack the US Top 100, peaking that year at number 61 in Billboard. Well, what do you know? I've said this before, and so has Neil, but it bears repeating. If we learned one thing from all of this, it was that a young artist's greatest asset is the word no. It's an immensely valuable word. There will always be pressure on you to compromise, pressure to sell your dreams short, and there will always be people who want you to be something that you're not, but none of these things can happen without your permission. My most urgent advice to aspiring artists is always, be true to yourself and just say no. Oh, and always take your wallet on stage with you. Bada bing! In anticipation of the album's release at the end of March, we hit the road to promote the thing. And on this tour, we sported a new look. When we had shot the album cover, I was taking fashion advice from Nancy, as Alex was from his wife Charlene, hence the hat he's wearing on the inner gatefold. To this day, all you have to do is ask him about the hat, and works will shrink down to a 2-inch size. Whenever Neil and I wanted to bust his chops, which was as often as possible, we loved to remind him about that hat. It's haunted him for years. Poor fellow, but in fairness, none of us looked exactly dressed to kill on that cover. More like for bed. Throughout the Xanadu period, I'd wear an even longer white satin robe with cowboy boots. You know, sort of how Legolas or Elrond would look if they lived in Texas. How does that Glenn Campbell song go? Like an elfin cowboy? Our stage apparel had always morphed without much rhyme or reason. After Rutsy left the band, we left our glitter period behind us as well, but still selected items of clothing that made us look more like we belonged on a stage and less like people on the street, albeit never with any consistent image in mind. Then, the summer before, on the Caress of Steel tour, we had a couple days off in San Francisco while staying at the Miyako Hotel in Jadetown. Wandering through a nearby mall, we found these inexpensive kimonos, and for some ungodly reason said, "Here's an idea, let's wear kimonos on stage." That's all there is to it. That's how the absurdly prophetic robes, as one critic would memorably put it, were born, right in time for 2112 and the Priest of Syrinx. Our first properly directed music videos, mainly live performances of A Farewell to Kings, Closer to the Heart, and Xanadu at Toronto's Seneca College Winkler Auditorium, would be largely responsible for establishing that unfortunately enduring image. There I am in all my youthful splendor, sporting a wizardly white satin mantle and cowboy boots I bought in El Paso, singing about the milk of paradise, kingdoms full of hatred and philosophers, plowmen, blacksmiths, and artists. It was only years later that we found the self-confidence to ditch such misguided and desperate attempts at epic haberdashery and simply walk out on stage in our t-shirts and jeans. It took us a while to grok that our music was our image. Slow learners, I guess. Good thing we had 45 years to figure it out. Following a couple of Canadian shows, we headed straight to the West Coast for some club dates in LA, and then several shows with Styx and Thin Lizzy. The Lizzies were absolutely smashing blokes, a couple of whom, particularly their wide-eyed and exuberant Scottish guitarist Brian Robbo Robertson, loved to imbibe the amber liquid, to our occasional peril. One time on a day off in Chicago, where we were booked on the same floor of the Holiday Inn on the lakeshore, we drank such copious amounts of booze, smoked so much, and became so raucous that complaints were made and the front desk called the cops. Suddenly, this rotund Chicago policeman barged into the room with a fellow officer. We floundered about trying to clear the air and hide the dope, and Robbo, slurring his words, wobbled over on a misguided peace mission. The rotund cop bellowed, "Back off, Sonny. Party's over. Now. Unless you want me to take a closer look around." Then it was all, "Yes, officer," and "Thank you, officer." Phew, close call. One arrest would have made it much harder for us foreigners to obtain another work permit for a long, long time. Some of the rental cars we drove around the country suffered mightily in the care of us young, bored musicians. We mostly wasted time by getting high, reading books, or jamming on acoustic guitars. But then there was the time I was awoken by the guys laughing idiotically. Sticking out of the strip of tar that seals the front windshield to the car shell was a bristling array of sharp objects, pins, pocket knives, and even a dimmick, the patented rush word for corkscrew, whose etymology eludes me. Like a vehicle out of Mad Max. Beat that for stir crazy. Another time, somewhere in the South, Alex and I stealthily tied folded strips of Kleenex into Hearn's hair as he drove. When we pulled into a Holiday Inn, Hearns put on his business face, and as we cackled like hyenas, marched up to the front desk, briefcase in hand, to check us in for the night, oblivious to how his curly locks were daintily adorned with fluttering white ribbons. By 1976, we could afford an upgrade to the aptly named Dodge Funcraft RV, a family camper van with a raised plastic ceiling that allowed for a bunk above the driver, twee little curtains, and a tiny wee table that folded down into bunks so one person could drive while the others slept. There was even a little microwave oven that Lurks took regular advantage of, mixing whatever foods happened to be on hand: tuna fish, baked beans, hot dogs, cheese whiz, you name it, to create, for lack of a better word, an interesting casserole. After tooling around in rental cars for so long, squished like sardines and sleeping on luggage, it was the lap of luxury. Challenged once to a drinking contest by the Lizzies, we sat at a tiny table and methodically drank all the Chivas Regal we could. Not to brag, but after being so soundly trounced by Nazareth, it was a much-needed win, even if afterwards there was some, cleaning up to do. On that tour, Neil created a rotation schedule for sharing hotel rooms, lest we become sick of one another. Not that I buy into all that zodiac freak. But Neil, Alex, and Liam were Virgos, with all the tendencies attributed to those born under that sign. They had a need for everything to be tickety-boo that used to drive me nuts. In the early days, Neil would lay out his smokes, John Player specials. One day, he'd even have his Lotus Europa painted the same black and gold as on the pack, like clockwork. And later in life, take his nightly glass of scotch, 2 fingers at exactly 5, so long as he wasn't working, while Alex kept his workspace fanatically tidy. Meanwhile, I, your classic Leo, flourished in disarray. It was immediately obvious which side of the studio was the neatniks, and which was mine, with its ever-present used coffee cup, cigs, and lyrics sheets strewn about should I be struck with an idea and want to quickly write it down. If I was working on, say, the melody of a vocal part and liked the way it was coming together, I'd sort of scan the spread with my peripheral vision, hoping that a lyric or theme that Alex had written would leap out at me. Mine was a contrived but useful mess. As I've amply illustrated, touring affords one an enormous surplus amount of time to get high or read, or both. But for me, there was no better distraction than movies. I could spend hours in front of the tube, lost in the Bowery Boys, the Three Stooges, and westerns with Roy Rogers, Randolph Scott, or John Wayne. I grew up watching the humanist dramedies of Charlie Chaplin, Preston Sturges, and Frank Capra, Sullivan's Travels, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and so on. In my 20s, I amassed classic movies on VHS and kept a stack of film compendiums close to hand. Halliwell's Film Guide and the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, among others, and read obsessively about the great directors of Hollywood's golden age. It was a labor of love, because in those days, there was no internet. You couldn't just look up Elia Kazan or Edward Dmytryk. I devoured Hitchcock/Truffaut, Strasberg's A Dream of Passion, Kings of the Bees, biographies of John Ford, Louis Buñuel, George Cukor, Akira Kurosawa, and Chaplin, and a couple about the great Orson Welles. After seeing Citizen Kane, I read the most respected book on Welles by the influential French film critic and founder of Cahiers du Cinéma, André Bazin. That was my introduction to more than 40 books he wrote on film, including his classic 2-volume What is Cinema? And his biography of Jean Renoir. On board the bus, when we got one, comedies by Mel Brooks, Steve Martin, and Woody Allen suited us best, especially after a show, when what we needed was to chill, down some inebriates, and laugh our heads off. We'd watch Young Frankenstein and High Anxiety, The Jerk and the Man with Two Brains, Take the Money and Run, and Annie Hall, and every episode we could tape of Canada's own SCTV on a loop until we had all the best lines memorized and could incorporate them into the Rush lexicon to regurgitate at will. We could be anywhere at any time, preferably in a boring meeting. That's a tautology, right? Or in a crowded dressing room after a show. We'd toss lines at one another like, "Into the mud, scum queen," or "I've got to go now, I'm due back on the planet Earth," and know exactly what that meant. We set up what we called vector theater. We often took Valiums, or vectors, as Hearns called them, to help us sleep while being tossed about in the bunk on rough roads. We'd sit on the sofa, put on a film, pop a V, and try to stay awake. Before long, someone would tilt their head back and nod out, bashing the aluminum Venetian blinds, which would clatter and wake them back up while the rest of us guffawed. We usually say B movies or even lesser films for Vector Theater because you knew you wouldn't get far past the opening credits anyway, but once in a while I'd throw on a classic drama such as Citizen Kane. That particular one led to the inevitable debate over the significance of Kane's last word, Rosebud, and along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, Kubla Khan, inspired Neil to write the lyrics to Xanadu. While mixing the intro, I couldn't help but visualize the news on the march sequence with the narrator announcing, "Legendary was Xanadu, where Kubla Khan decreed his stately pleasure dome." There was no competing with Bernard Herrmann's foreboding musical score for the movie, but it was still fun to reimagine it in our own proggy context. Well into my 30s, movies and books about movies fed my brain. It was a largely solitary preoccupation, as only a couple of my friends had the same degree of interest or patience for old black and white films, especially ones with subtitles. But no matter, it's not necessarily a group sport. Film became a gateway for me, leading to a range of other visual arts disciplines, especially photography, which would seep into our live shows as I became more involved in the designs for our rear screen projections. Increasingly, I'd come to think of our shows as a mixed media experience rather than simply a musical event. I'd take a harder look at animation and graphic design, which led to an interest in architecture. There were things I could study my own way, in my own time. In lieu of the formal schooling I'd miss, the museums, galleries, and streets of the world became for me a kind of classroom. Much of that became possible only later in my touring life, when I actually had days off. But by the 80s and 90s, it was not unusual for me to bump into Neil, wandering around too, and he introduced me to a game. Surrounded by paintings, whether we knew the artist or not. He'd say, "Choose one from each room. Imagine you can take it home to hang on your wall. Which would you want to live with?" It was a sensual and not necessarily intellectual response to art, which led me to wonder which art is best hanging in museums as a gift to the populace, and which is just as well gloated over in someone's basement or yacht. I particularly loved the German expressionists and would always defer to an Emil Nolde or a Max Beckmann if one was there. At a Freudian level, I must have been drawn to what the Nazis called degenerate art. I liked what they hated. Well, that's the end of Chapter 12. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.